Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar about Bermuda data privacy. Thank you for sparing the time. It's very much appreciated. As people are still joining, we'll cover off some housekeeping aspects, and I have a thank you to say. Thank you to Sheridan Smith, who helps with the ISC chartering chapter in Bermuda. Thank you very much for sponsoring and helping raise awareness of this webinar today. It's very much appreciated. So today we've got some high-level objectives and some housekeeping. So these are the things that we're going to run through today. We're going to establish what PIPA is and how it might affect your organisation and the actions that you need to take to prepare. We're going to talk about the international data privacy and cybersecurity landscape. And we're going to talk about some of the similarities between PIPA and GDPR, and also with NYCRR 500 that some of you might be calling the NYDFS regulation, but its full name is the very catchy NYCRR 500. We're also going to talk about where to get further help and information, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions. So please do that as we go along. You'll notice in the GoToWebinar application that we're using for this webinar that there's a box, usually on the right-hand side of your screen, where you can actually type questions. Please do ask those questions as we go along. I will be prompting you as we get closer to question time to ask those questions and to make sure that you've got them asked before we run out of time. So final housekeeping, as I said, any questions there? And the webinar will be recorded, and we will be making it available as both a video and as a podcast in the next few days. So without further ado, let's start talking about what PIPA is. And I'm going to be, for the duration of this webinar, and I'll probably slip up, but I'll be calling it PIPA. I know it seems to be some debate as to whether it's PIPA, PIPA, but I'm going to be calling it PIPA. Just to pick a side and to stick with it. So a little bit of background about PIPA. We can see that PIPA has been around since 2016. It became a law in 2016. That doesn't mean that it was enforced during that time. There was a 2-year period for enforcement and implementation. That's 2016 to 2018. And then PIPA enforcement actually comes in at the end of 2018. Okay, the Act itself isn't specific about that, but the Bermuda government has said that they're looking to have this in place at the end of 2018. So throughout this, you'll see me talking about the latter part of 2018 and December 2018. As we move through this chart, the first uses of PIPA by individuals, so individuals actually asserting their rights and asking questions about the data that organisations are keeping on them. That's going to be in 2019. And potentially the first PIPA legal cases are going to come to bear during 2019 as well. And we'll talk about what those are and why there will definitely be legal cases in the case of PIPA. On the right-hand side here, we talk about some of the details. Some of these are very similar to regulations in other parts of the world. Particularly the definition of a child that complies with COPA in the USA, and also, broadly speaking, GDPR in Europe. So there are some real similarities. One of the differences is the way that fines will be administered under PIPA. In the case of Bermudian data privacy, so PIPA, it's going to be determined by the courts. So that's one of the reasons, at least, why there will definitely be legal cases, because unlike GDPR, where the fines going to be administered by the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK or another data protection authority, in Bermuda, it's going to be administered purely by the courts and decided purely by the courts. PIPA's objective is very much around bringing data privacy to Bermuda. And I would argue as well that I think there's a longer term goal to achieve equivalency with European data protection and North American data protection where that becomes appropriate. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about North American data protection, but I think with all the aspects of the Facebook case recently, there's definitely going to be a heightened level of data protection regulation in the USA. Okay, I'm going to run through some of the definitions of PIPA. This is really to set the baseline and make sure everyone's got at least some understanding of what PIPA is and what some of the terminology is. And if you're not familiar with PIPA or any of these terms, it's really going to serve as a good introduction for you. If you are familiar with those, then perhaps it will act as a refresher, but nevertheless, I think it's a good baselining to make sure that everyone's at the same level. So an individual, this is the natural person who is essentially the subject of the personal data or the sensitive personal data. So if you're storing details about a person that you're using, whose details you're using for marketing, John Smith, for example, and they have an email address, John Smith would actually be the natural person and would be the individual in that case. Personal data is any information about an identified or identifiable individual. Okay, I've given some examples here. So a name can be personal data, an employee ID is personal data. Employee appraisals are very often considered to be personal data too. A social security number or national insurance number or similar is also is personal data. Obviously, bank account details, all of those items there. Now, the last one I put on there is IP address. Now, some of the more IT orientated people on the call might think, oh, well, an IP address, doesn't necessarily identify an individual. But in other parts of the world, an IP address is considered to be personal data. It's not defined specifically within PIPA, but it may be one of those areas of consideration because PIPA doesn't specify or give a long list of examples, if you like, of personal data. Very much leaves it up to the company to decide, or the organization to decide, what their personal data is. Now, sensitive personal data. Now, I'm not going to read all of this out, but I am going to give a couple of examples. Sensitive personal data tends to be the sorts of things that, or include the sorts of things that people have historically been persecuted for or differentiated on. So things like origin, race, color, ethnicity, sexual orientation, those kind of things, mental health details. You can see all of the details there. They're the kind of things that are, by their very nature, a little bit more personal, a little bit more sensitive. So if you're capturing information of this type, then you need to be particularly careful and be particularly sure that you need to capture all of this information in order to provide the service to the individual. And in addition to what's usually gathered at this time, or usually defined as personal information, you notice as well the last two there, biometric information and genetic information, as this is increasingly commonly captured either in hospitals or used for identification purposes. It's now become part of the sensitive personal data. And that's very similar to GDPR as well. In fact, this list itself is very, very similar to GDPR. There's a couple of extra things on here for PIPA than appears on GDPR, but essentially they're very, very similar and have the same intention. Use, so use of personal data particularly. Now, I'm looking through this list, you really can't find anything that you can do with personal data that isn't considered to be use. The obtaining, the recording, holding, storing, etc., etc. The list goes on right the way through the full data life cycle. So essentially, if you are collecting personal data or doing anything with personal data in Bermuda, you're going to have to be PIPA compliant. Privacy notices are a means of raising the awareness of the individual about the data that you're collecting and what you're going to be doing with it and who else is going to be doing things with it. So this is a a mandatory requirement when you're obtaining an individual's consent to process their data. Now, I'll talk more about consent in a moment, but it is a very important concept. So if it's not one that you're familiar with, then please do make sure you pay attention to the consent slide. But when you're gaining consent, you must ensure that the individual is well informed about what they're providing their data for and how it's going to be used, who it's going to be used for, who it's going to be used by, and where it's going to be sent. So if it's going to be sent offshore outside of Bermuda, then you need to make sure that the organization you're sending it to is going to process and use that data in the right ways in accordance with your purpose, and also that that the individual is aware of the reasons and the location of that data being sent, where it's going to be sent. So here we go with consent. Now, consent has to be an active decision by the individual. Now, there are circumstances where that's not possible. Okay, now you can think about those, what those would be for your business. But one example that I tend to use when talking to people from different sectors is a recruitment agency, for example. So a recruitment agency may encourage people to send their CVs and resumes through to them by email. Okay, now that may or may not be a good way to send personal data, but if that's what they're doing and the individual consents to that process by sending their CV or their resume by email, then they've actually consented to that process. Now, at that point, obviously, the recruitment agency hasn't had the opportunity to present their privacy notice or do any of that other information at that point. So obviously, they've got assumed consent there by virtue of the person sending the information through. Now, there's a best practice associated with this, which would be to actually send a copy of the privacy notice back in those kind of cases, so that the person can opt out if they didn't realise what they were actually signing themselves up for. But that's a kind of best practice. Other best practices, make sure that it's opt-in, so the person's actually ticking that tick box on the web form. Making sure that you're recording the consent, very important, far more important in PIPA, and particularly if you're doing business with Europe as well, that's particularly important. And where it's appropriate, ask for multiple consents. So you may get an on-screen consent from a web form, for example, and where appropriate, send a secondary consent request through to an email address, for example. That's particularly important if you're dealing with children, or you're dealing with the elderly or the infirm, or people who may not be able to always make consent or give consent on their own, or may be confused by the consent process. So just make sure you're covering off all the bases there. Okay, let's talk about what some of the impacts on the organisation are and how PIPA will change things a little bit for organisations. Now, obviously, the impacts of any one organisation are going to differ and vary from organisation to organisation. But what I've tried to cover here is cover some of the bases where these things will affect most organisations, and you can think about others that are specific to your organisation. And I'm more than happy to, both in questions or indeed to have a call with people afterwards to run through some of those differences and apply it more to your business if that's appropriate. One of the big impacts is going to be changes in contracts. So if you use your customers' personal data, so you're collecting their data, so you're a B2C kind of organization, business to consumer, you must ensure that your contracts are appropriate for PIPA. Okay. Now, by appropriate, I mean that they are including aspects of data protection, that they are making it clear where the individual should contact should they have a question or a complaint. So that's really going to be a duplicate of your privacy notice in all likelihood. But all of that information needs to be included in your contract so that you're ensuring that the the individual is informed about what their data is going to be used for. They understand their rights as a data subject and, sorry, an individual, and how those can be applied and used within your organization or with your organization. Some examples of the kind of contracts that those on the line are likely to be encountering and may need to update. Insurance policy applications, very obviously, where you're capturing personal data there, you're going to need to make sure that the terms are updated so that they include all the information I just spoke about. Bank account applications, again, another one, and there'll be many, many others. But those two are very, very obvious ones, and ones that most people can understand, irrespective of their business sector and business experience. Now, the other side of changes in contracts is if you are a third-party provider, so you actually provide a service to another organization. So you process the personal data, use that personal data in order to provide a service to the organization that collects the data in the first place. So if you are doing that, again, your data privacy statements within your contracts with your clients have to be updated. So this is very much a B2B, business to business kind of arrangement. So your contracts have to be updated to ensure that you will be processing the data only in accordance with PIPA and the original purpose. And you also have to make sure that you are going to be able to make and adhere to any service level agreements relating to data privacy and the requirements of PIPA as well. So think around the kind of contracts that you have in place with your organizations now, with your clients' organizations, and how that might need to change. At the very least, you're definitely going to have to review your contracts to ensure they're compliant. Maybe that you're very good and everything's covered off already, but the likelihood is there's going to be at least a few updates there, if only to include your updated privacy notice. And thank you very much. I can see questions coming in. That's excellent news. Please don't be shy. Ask as many questions as you like, and we'll certainly get to as many as we can towards the end. You're going to need good, strong policies within your organization. Now, if you're working for an international organization, as many of you are on this call, it may be that you've got policies in place already that are going to be perfectly suitable and meet all the requirements of PIPA. If you don't have all the policies in place at the moment, then you're definitely going to need to put those in place, because PIPA asks and demands that you can demonstrate your compliance with with the Act, with the law. So you need to be able to do that, and the way that you can do that is through your policies, and also through educating your staff as well, making sure your staff are aware, so that your policies don't just become shelfware. They don't just get written and typed up in lovely and beautiful fonts on thick paper, and then they sit in a filing cabinet or on a shelf somewhere, never to be looked at again, and everyone just does what they need to do to get the job done. So make sure your policies are up to date and enacted, and that people actually know about them. Some examples of the types of policies that you're likely to need, and obviously you may have these combined into one document, or they may all be separate documents as I've represented them here. But you're definitely going to need a data privacy policy. Hopefully that's clear already. You're going to need an information security policy. Sometimes those get joined together, and that's okay, but you're definitely going to need to cover off the basis of both of those. You're going to need a data continuity policy, because you need to keep the data safe from destruction. That's part of the PIPA, is you keep it safe, the data safe for and available for use, and from erroneous destruction. You're going to need a data retention policy, just to make sure that you're only keeping the data for the right length of time, the right period. And you're going to make sure that you are working with your vendors and selecting your vendors in the right way. So you're going to need a vendor selection and vendor management policy and system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Your business processes are going to change beyond a shadow of a doubt. There'll be some changes. They may be major, they may be minor, depending on the size of your organisation and the type of business you're in. So if you're a reinsurer, for example, you're less likely to have major changes in your business processes than if you're a B2C insurer, processing personal lines, for example. The types of changes that are going to need to take place, they'll vary slightly, but it's going to be things like processes for dealing with the applicant's requests for their personal information. We'll talk about some of the rights of the individual in a moment, but making sure that you've got the business processes in place to deal with some of those. Other processes, making sure that you can deal with the request for data corrections. So this isn't just the ability to correct data within your systems and databases and things, it's actually having a process and the ability for an individual to contact your organization or notify them that there's a change that needs to be made, and this is the details of the change. It's likely that your business systems are going to have to change too, very much going on the basis of what's been necessary under the GDPR. There are lots of different system changes that have been required, and because GDPR and PIPA are quite similar in some respects, I'm anticipating similar kinds of changes in Bermuda. Now, where you're using systems that are compliant with GDPR already, then you may already be compliant even without knowing it. You may be able to configure those changes in. Where you've either got in-house systems or your systems are actually a combination of spreadsheets or something like that, then you're going to have to think about what those changes need, what changes need to be made, and how they might impact your organization. And as far as possible, you're going to want adherence to PIPA and the other regulations around the world to be as automated as possible. So things like automated document destruction or data destruction when you meet a retention date. When I say automatic, obviously you're going to get warnings before it happens, but essentially if you ignore the warnings, or if the warnings are if the warnings are just that, then you will ultimately have your data deleted. You can obviously build the workflows that are appropriate for you, but you want to, as much as possible, to become automated. You don't really want PIPA to become a large burden on your organization. Breach monitoring is another good one. Having software and systems in place to monitor access to your organization's data. If you're a larger organization, again, you've perhaps already looked at this or perhaps have things in place, but do consider all of these things and think about how you can ease the burden and actually improve the safety and the resiliency of your organization through these changes. User access is always it's a common one, and many organisations will think they've got this well under control. But a number of times that Fifth Step has done security audits or indeed GDPR audits, and we find that some of the most powerful people within the organisation are the graduates who came in on the graduate training programme, who have moved from one department to the next, to the next, to the next. And before you know it, they have access to all of the systems, because access is given but never taken away, because it's not so common for people historically to move from department to department. And with a new grad program, for example, sometimes those things get overlooked. So make sure you've got all the appropriate changes in place, and consider the IT changes and the business system changes as part of your PIPA compliance project and program. So here's some thoughts on which kinds of organisations and which departments are affected the most. And this is based on Fifth Step's experience of implementing data privacy regulation around the world for the last 7 years, as I say there on the slide. There's certainly some commonality. Financial services organisations and others within highly governed and governance orientated and highly regulated sectors tend to be very affected. So insurers, brokers, reinsurers, banks, and particularly those dealing with personal lines, and the retail banks particularly. If you work for one of those organisations, hopefully you're already aware of PIPA and you're going to be making those changes or perhaps already on your way. Law firms are also exposed now. With minimal mention of things like the Panama Papers and things like that, law firms collect a lot of personal data, and that personal data is sometimes unstructured, meaning that it's in Word documents or in PowerPoint presentations even sometimes. So think about that kind of aspect. If you're a law firm and you're collecting lots of Word documents or lots of PDF documents, chances are you've got personal data in there. And think about how you're securing those. Is it appropriate? Is it PIPA compliant? And how are you going to deal with that going forward? Online retailers, I know there's a couple of organisations who are represented today on this webinar who are online retailers. Online retailers tend to collect a lot of personal data. It tends to be a very B2C orientated businesses. So make sure the data you're collecting is both minimal and appropriate, and that you're compliant. Okay. Healthcare providers, goes without saying, you guys are collecting a lot of personal data and also sensitive personal data. So you have to make sure whether you're an insurer providing health cover, or whether you are actually part of the health giving and healthcare community. You have to make sure that you are complying with PIPA and making sure that you're making the information available as appropriate, but also keeping it safe and secure. Hopefully nothing there that's a surprise to anyone. Now, as for the departments, so across, irrespective of sector, these are the departments we tend to find are impacted by increases and changes in data privacy regulation. So HR departments capture a whole heap of personal data. They very often have to change the way that they're working, or look at the way they're securing the data to make sure that they're remaining compliant with that regulation. Marketing departments also hold a lot of data, and with PIPA and with GDPR, it's likely to lead to changes in how organisations will be conducting their marketing going forwards, and how that might, how they collect lists and things like that. In-house legal counsel, for similar reasons to law firms, they have to go through all of the contracts. They have to make sure that everything is compliant, and they have to understand and be up to speed with PIPA very quickly. IT departments, just because there's a lot of IT change very often. It's you can't do much of that stuff very often without at least some involvement with IT departments. Even if you're buying software off the shelf, there'll be updates to some of this software, either for GDPR or for PIPA or for other regulation that you're going to need to apply. Finance departments, they often have to go through a number of changes and iterations on this, because they very often hold more financial sensitive and personal information than is sometimes appreciated. And procurement departments, just from the perspective of, you need to make sure you're holding your vendors and your suppliers to account. Now, I've talked about third parties a little bit earlier on, and the importance, particularly if you are a third party servicing a client, of how you're going to remain compliant. But if a supplier is responsible for misuse through a data breach, okay, the company, so the collector of the data, still remains liable under PIPA. So you need to think about this. It's not that, oh well, I hired a third party, it's their fault. You still retain liability under PIPA. So outsourcing under both PIPA and GDPR is absolutely fine to do, absolutely fine. You just need to make sure that you've got your vendor management systems and processes in place, and that they are PIPA fit. Okay. Now, if you're unsure what that means beyond that, okay, it's going to mean that your third parties can adhere to the service level agreements that you need them to adhere to in order to comply. So if you get an access request, so someone asking for their data, a copy of their data, for example, and that's held in a third party's system, that third party has to be able to extract that data and provide that report to you in enough time that you can still comply with the SLAs under PIPA. So consider those basic things. Very much it's just about good vendor management, but we need to just make sure that that your processes are there and that you're actually monitoring and measuring and making sure that they're correct in an ongoing fashion, not just a one and done. When you hire the third party, you need to be going back, month after month and making sure that they're still fit, that they're still doing the good job, that their processes haven't slipped, that their cybersecurity processes and approach to cybersecurity hasn't slipped or something. Now, under PIPA, you have to be able to report a breach without undue delay. Okay. Now, that doesn't give a specific time frame, and that's a little bit different to most of the other regulation around the world. Most of the other regulation around the world, such as the NYCRR 500 and GDPR, both of those are settled on 72 hours, and that's 72 working hours, and it's 72 hours from the point where the breach is identified, not 72 hours, from when when it's discovered on a Friday, we stop the clock over the weekend or anything like that. It's 72 hours, the clock starts running and doesn't stop until the 72nd hour is reached. Okay, so undue delay gives a little bit more latitude in Bermuda, but don't be fooled into a false sense of security on this. This edition of PIPA is unlikely to be the last update to this, in my opinion. I think that there'll be subsequent updates and refinements in a few years' time, and that's very, very normal for this kind of documentation. To give you a very potted history of some of the other regulations, for example, they tend to be updated sort of every 10 to 15 to 20 years, depending on how much change needs to be implemented. So that may mean that you've got another 10 years before it's updated again, but don't let your organization get lulled into a false sense of security on this. Practice best practices. Okay, and if best practice is 72 hours, or if you can't achieve 72 hours, then whatever you can achieve, but make sure that you're breach ready. Okay, that you've got a good incident response plan that covers all of the bases, that you know what to do, that you know who you're going to communicate with, you know who's going to do that communication. Make sure that you're prepared, because I've been in breach situations that where an organization hasn't been ready, okay? And I can tell you it's no fun trying to pick up the pieces in a very short period of time and trying to establish whether the breach is ongoing or whether the hack is ongoing and things like that. So not fun, and not not the time to be trying to reinvent the wheel or invent a wheel in the first instance, and trying to decide who you're going to contact and who's going to do it. Okay, so be prepared for those kind of things. Have a breach readiness plan. Now, unlike some of the other data protection regulations, for example, the Russian data protection regulation, as well as GDPR, and the Chinese data protection regulation, all three of those have an aspect to them that says you can't send the data out of the country or the region in certain circumstances. So in the Russian data protection regulation, you can't send the data about Russian residents. It all has to be stored within Moscow. Oh, sorry, not Moscow. Within Russia. Now, PIPA, however, is a lot more free going in this respect, and it's very much down to the organisation to decide whether it's appropriate and whether the organisation in the country will treat the data with the same level of respect and will adhere to and comply with PIPA. Okay, so have a think about that when you're actually transferring data between your your vendors or your partners, or indeed other parts of the group if you're part of a large international organisation. Now, there is going to be some advice that's going to come from the Bermudian government in time, okay, about which countries are considered to have comparable protection. But essentially, make sure that you've got good contracts in place. Okay, it goes back to contracts that we spoke about earlier on, and make sure that the vendor who's processing the data on your behalf is going to be held accountable to PIPA, even if they are overseas, but you hold them to the same standards through your business contracts. Okay, so have a think about what that means for you. If you send a large amount of personal data outside of the country at the moment, and when I say send outside, that can be you use Azure, the Microsoft data hosting environment, for example, to store your data. That's actually sending it overseas. So have a think about what that means for your organisation. Are there changes that you need to make? Other business changes, or are you perfectly happy with the way that your data will be considered once PIPA comes into enforcement? Now, I've talked a lot about some of the different types of data protection and international data protection. Okay, we're going to move on to talk specifically about some of those now. And just another quick reminder, I can see questions are coming in, but do please carry on asking those questions. It's always better to have more questions. If that's the case, I'll contact people afterwards and circulate those, and perhaps even answer them on the podcast or video version of this webinar if we have too many. But do please carry on asking those questions. Okay, here's a high-level map of some of the data protection regulation, and there really is a myriad of data protection. Now, I've deliberately left Bermuda off of here because we've been speaking about Bermuda a lot and about PIPA, so I've deliberately left it off of this slide. But you can see there's a lot of different data protection. But it's not all equal. So you'll see some of the key requirements, and I've only pulled out 5 here to score them against. Whether they need a CISO or a data protection officer, so a chief information security officer or a data protection officer. Do they have a concept of personal data? Do they have a concept of consent required? Do they have a breach notification requirement? And is it geosensitive? So can you send the data outside of the country or outside of the region, like I was talking about earlier on? Let's just touch on a couple here. I hope this slide is fairly self-explanatory, but the European regulation is obviously GDPR, and I'm going to talk more about GDPR in a moment. So, let's talk about the Australian regulation, for example. The Australian regulation there does have the concept of a CISO or DPO. They don't necessarily enforce it, but they do recommend it. They do have a concept of personal data. They do usually require consent, but it's not quite as strong as some of the other international regulation. And in some cases, they do need a breach notification, but it's not geographically sensitive. So Australian data can be sent to other locations under Australian data protection law. The Russian requirements there, I said earlier on, they've got a geosensitive aspect to them. They do have the concept of consent, and they do identify personal data, but they don't want anyone specific to be in charge or in control of that data, such as a CISO or a DPO. It's the entire organization that remains responsible. And let's do another continental American country in the shape of Argentina this time. The Argentinian regulation was actually based very much on the Data Protection Directive, which is the predecessor to GDPR. So they have the concept of a CISO or a DPO, but they don't require it. They do have the recognition of personal data, but they don't have strong consent requirements or breach notification, or indeed geosensitivity requirements there. Okay, but Argentina at this point in time is recognized by the EU, however, as being an equivalent, having data protection directive equivalence. So one of the few countries, I think there's about 13 different countries at the moment that have that. of which the USA is not one of them, not natively anyway. There are a couple of things you can do in the US to become equivalent, and that includes the EU-US Privacy Shield requirement. But if that's something that you need to know more about, then do feel free to ask a question about it, or I can get in contact with you afterwards if you drop me an email through to the info@fifthstep.com email address. So let's talk about PIPA's similarities with the GDPR. Now, on the left-hand side, this is the data subject's rights. Okay, so the rights of the data subject. Now, a data subject in GDPR is more or less the same definition as the individual under PIPA. So it's the person whose data is being used. Okay, so the data subject's rights here, there are 8 of them under GDPR, and there's 2 that don't apply under PIPA. So I'll give you a real quick overview of these because it will apply to PIPA, the PIPA rights as well. So the right to be informed is talks about how the data subject must be informed about what their data is going to be used for and how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, etc. So that's very much about the privacy notification. Okay, the right of access is where the data subject or the individual under PIPA has the right to ask for a copy of their personal data. And the organization who is processing that data, using that data, must then comply. Okay, now there are some ways and means you can defer that, and there are even some cases where an organization can say no, but on the whole, okay, you have to comply. And if you've got questions about what those edge cases may be, if you think that's going to be important to you, please ask it as a question, or indeed drop me an email, and I will come back to you and we can have a conversation about that. The right to rectification is the right to correction of data. So you must have a process to be able to correct data that's been identified by the data subject or the individual. The right to erasure. Now, being of the age I am, I usually make a joke here about the right to other 80s bands as well. But as I get older, I find that fewer and fewer people understand that joke. So perhaps I'll have to stop making it one day. So the right to erasure is about the right to delete data. So a data subject or an individual can ask that their data be removed. Okay, and again, organizations can in certain circumstances say we can't remove this data, we can't delete this data because of other legal requirements. For example, anti-money laundering is a very good case in point. So where the data, where PIPA or GDPR is surpassed by something like anti-money laundering regulation, it is actually surpassed. You must adhere to anti-money laundering, and the GDPR or PIPA is not does not apply in those cases. The right to restrict processing is having identified an issue with the data subject or the individual has the right to restrict processing and say, actually, you can't process my data until either it's corrected or until I have a good understanding of the fact that you are taking my complaint seriously. And the right to object to processing, very, very similar. Okay, that's about being able to control the use of the data and to be able to say, well, you said you're only collecting it for one purpose, but now you've actually started to process it for another purpose. So you said you were going to collect it just to process my insurance policy, but now you're sending me emails advertising other insurance policies that I might be interested in. That may be, depending on the definition of purposes, that may be that may not be appropriate. And the 2 that aren't applicable under PIPA, I'll cover those off quickly. The right to data portability under the GDPR, a data subject has the right to extract a copy of their data, their personal data, in machine-readable form. You can imagine the kinds of websites that are going to make full use of that. The comparison websites, insurance comparison websites, I'm absolutely sure are going to be doing a thriving business once GDPR comes into enforcement in Europe at the end of May. with every organisation having to provide an electronic copy of their data, and that has to be in a recognised machine readable format, so it can't just be an extract that no one can make use of. And the final right under GDPR is the right to manual processing. This gives a data subject the right under GDPR to request that their case be reviewed by a person where the decision has been made by a machine. So let me use the example of if you're applying for a mortgage or for a loan, for example. Very often these days that's processed with the minimal amount of human input. The computer system will take into account how much you want to borrow, what the purpose of the loan is, and your credit score, and then it'll go through a number of different types and weigh other factors together, and then ultimately the computer will say yes or no. Now, if the computer says no at that point, then the data subject has the right to ask for their case to be reviewed manually, okay, to be processed manually. It may be, for example, that they believe that there's another John Smith who lives next door, and that they believe that this institution is perhaps confusing them with that John Smith. And if that's the case, then obviously they have to be able to process that information manually, but then also update the information and make sure that that confusion doesn't occur again. So I hope that explains some of the similarities and indeed a couple of the differences. So let's also talk about the breach notifications. I mentioned earlier on that both PIPA and the GDPR require the notification of a commissioner or the data protection authority, in the case of the GDPR, to be notified in case of a breach. So another similarity there. So if you've already got these controls in place, because you're part of a group that has offices in Europe and they've needed to comply with GDPR, to make sure that you're reusing those controls and understanding those implications. And as I say at the top, PIPA is really a subset of GDPR in many respects, and it's probably easier to move from GDPR to PIPA than the other way around. So if you have a choice of which you implement, you might decide that you want to go that little bit further and be compliant with PIPA, whilst obviously, be compliant with GDPR, whilst obviously being legal in respect to PIPA. Depends what kind of organisation you are, how fast you're growing, how likely it is that you're going to need to comply with GDPR. If all of your business is targeted at Bermudian organisations, then chances are it's not going to be the right thing for you to do, to be targeting and becoming compliant with GDPR. Just stick with PIPA, okay? But take that view. And some of the similarities and some of the differences with MICRR 500. So MICRR 500, for those of you who are not aware of it, is a piece of regulation in the US. It's enforced by the New York Department of Financial Services, and it applies to financial services companies who are regulated out of New York. Okay, so it doesn't cover the whole of the United States and doesn't cover everything by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have some similarities and indeed some differences to PIPA and to the GDPR for that matter. So PIPA and PIPA and MICRR 500 have very different objectives. MICRR 500 is more data security and information security and cyber security orientated, where of course PIPA is all about data privacy. So they come at things from a slightly different perspective, but they end up with very similar approaches. And that's no mistake, because both of them are drawing upon and codifying best practices as far as possible. So both MICRR 500 and PIPA, they share the concept of personal data. The definitions differ very slightly, and MICRR 500 is more targeted towards financial data and things like that. But all of that said, it does have a definition. And both of them require breach notification, and both of them require a data protection officer or a CISO. Okay, where they differ, MICRR 500, for example, mandates multi-factor authentication and pen testing. Those things are not mandated under PIPA, although they are a best practice. So many organisations may be doing them already or be thinking about it, but it's not mandated under PIPA. But if you are compliant with NYCRR 500 in another part of your group, then that may be something that you can draw upon again. And encryption is mandated. Now, encryption is one of those things that lots of people talk about. It's not the be-all and end-all, it's not the panacea, but it is a tool in the toolbox. So if given that NYCRR 500 mandates it, then if you're going to do that, then that's great. It'll definitely make you stronger, and it will make it less likely that you're going to have a breach of personal data in many cases. There are many different frameworks out there, and so far I've been talking a lot about the regulatory ones, GDPR, NYCRR 500. There's HIPAA and there's COPA as well. So think about those if you are part of a group, and you can reuse some of those things. But don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, the purpose of me saying reuse, repurpose, reduce, and reuse, repurpose, and reduce effort is very much about not reinventing the wheel, reusing the controls that you've already got, or where you haven't got those, make use of controls that are out there and frameworks that are out there, such as ISO 27001, which is the international standard for information security, ISO 22301, which is the international standard for business continuity, the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is the North American standard for cybersecurity, and the regulations that I've already spoken about. Now, one of the things that Fifth Step has been helping a number of clients with, is particularly larger clients, is that they want a single global framework, and this was considered improbable, if not impossible, by some organisations, just because there was lots of regulation coming in, and it was different, and it had a different orientation and stuff like that. Well, Fifth Step's proven that that's not impossible, and we're actually doing that for a number of our clients and helping them implement that. So if that's something that's of interest to you, then do please let me know, and I'm more than happy to have a chat with you about that, and or have someone else chat with you about it and go into some of the detail as appropriate. And it really is useful if you're already an existing international company, or you're an expanding business who needs to look at the future and make sure that they're compliant, or that they are governance and compliance ready for their future. Then it really does help save time by making sure that you can be geographically agnostic and you can trade where the business is, as opposed to having to set up new compliance and governance requirements as you move into a new region. I said that I'd give you some high-level next steps, and these are some of the high-level next steps. Now, you've still got a little bit of time, obviously, until PIPA comes into enforcement. So I would encourage, if you haven't got a program or a project running at the moment about PIPA, I would encourage you to start at the very least with these simple next steps of understanding your data protection and privacy maturity, so where you are at the moment, improving your understanding of your data. What personal data have you got? What sensitive personal data have you got? Do you need it all? Can you cut down the amount of data you're using and collecting? Making sure you're improving your policies, processes, and procedures in readiness for PIPA. Implement and test your data breach plan. Make sure you've got one, make sure it's tested. And implement continual improvement. Now, that may sound like almost a trite thing to say. It's become a fashionable thing to say, something that Fifth Step have been advocating for some time. But what we've seen in other parts of the world is that organisations implement their data compliance and data privacy requirements, and then they finish. It's a one and done project. Okay, well, it can't be like that if you're going to maintain your governance and requirements, okay, on an ongoing basis. And the world's not quite like that anymore. So you need to make sure that you're keeping things up to speed and up to scratch. So it's we're fast approaching question time, and we've got some questions in the question window. But again, a little bit of encouragement to ask some questions. And let's talk about where you can get some help. And whilst you all desperately type very quickly all your burning questions. So a shameless plug, if you want to know more about GDPR, I wrote a book about GDPR. It's one of the first books to talk about how to become compliant in GDPR. It was a #1 bestseller in Amazon's business law category, and I don't think it's been out of the number 10 in that category. Sorry, out of the top 10 in that category since it's been released. So it's out there. It's in paperback format, although I don't think you can order paperback directly to Bermuda, but you guys will know better than I do. But it's also available as Kindle ebook. So do please take a look at that if you want to know more about GDPR. It'll also help with your understanding of PIPA. If you still want yet more information, FISTEP provides a lot of free information out there. Do please visit our website, fistep.com, and we've got podcasts out there, we've got blogs, we've got videos, we've got best practice guides, we've got a heap of material out there. All about data privacy and NYCRR 500 GDPR. We'll have an increasing amount about PIPA over the coming months as well. Obviously, any point in time, you can get in contact with FISTEP at info@fistep.com and visit FISTEP website, and you can follow us on social media. So follow us on Twitter at FISTEP, and you can find us on LinkedIn. If you search for FISTEP Limited or go to linkedin.com/company and then FISTEP-Limited, you'll find us there. So we've reached that important time of question time. So we've got a few questions here. Still time to ask some more questions though, if anyone's got any burning issues. So let's see. We've got a question here from David. So maybe you'll come onto this later. But what's the impact and need for compliance on regulatory bodies with PIPA? Is this known yet? No, it's not stated within the Act as to regulatory bodies are not drawn out or talked about explicitly. Governmental bodies are talked about. So I guess in that respect, you might draw some parallels there. But at this point in time, my belief and my recommendation to you would be to believe that you are covered by PIPA and the requirement for you to comply with PIPA. That's going to mean that you're collecting a lot of data, and I know, David, that will be exactly why you're asking the question, I would imagine. You're collecting a lot of data that may be personal data and even personal sensitive data from some of the organisations that you're regulating. Thank you, Sean, for liking my erasure joke. I'm not making any judgment there on whether that puts us in the same age group. I think you're probably a little bit younger than I am, but thank you anyway. And the last question that I've got here, there's a couple of duplicate questions or some questions that I've already answered, but is it also possible to get a copy of the slides? It absolutely is, and they'll be available from the FISTEP website. You can visit those, but you'll also get an email reminding you that a copy of the webinar is available as both a podcast and will be available as a video. So if you've got colleagues who couldn't make it today, or indeed if you're so enamored with listening to my voice and my jokes about erasure that you want to come back and listen a second or third time, then it will actually be available as a video podcast, sorry, a video as well. We post them out onto YouTube. So if that's something that you'd like to do, then do keep an eye on the FISTEP website. Check back in a couple of days' time, and we'll have that loaded up there, and you'll be able to watch it to your heart's content. And do please remember, if you've got any questions subsequently, either on a second watching or indeed if you are listening to this and didn't attend the webinar live, then do please reach out. Drop an email through to info@fistep.com. If there's no more other questions, because there was about half a dozen there, but I think I've covered them all as we go through, as we went through. If there's no more questions, I'm going to wrap this podcast up and thank you again for your time. I hope you found it useful. This is one of the first podcasts, I think, and webinars that's been specifically about PIPA, and I hope to do others and to continue to raise awareness. Fifth Step has been in Bermuda for the last 5 years, working with our clients there. So we're very much vested and a vested interest in helping Bermudian organisations and those new and old in Bermuda become compliant with this regulation. It's a real thing. It's something will really improve business in Bermuda, is my opinion, and really help those in Bermuda feel as if they've got control of their data. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to speak to you again on another webinar in future. Thanks very much.